Hello everybody, welcome to More Chainsaws Needed, where, because I love horror, thrillers and suspense, I'm going to talk, rant, rave about, review and recommend movies, TV series and books in those genres for you guys as I draw. So I have been away a bit and I apologize for that. But life gets in the way and then things happen and before you know it, it's 2 months since your last video and 1 week before Comic Con as you are writing the script and 1 week after Comic Con because you got a flu and you still sound a little bit raspy and yeah. In any case, I started working on this particular script in May 8th because I want to talk about one of the best horror comedies of the 90s, a franchise that still keeps going despite it not being that popular with the general public, and a great actor that left us too soon. Yeah, I am talking about Tremors, the 1990 original movie with Kevin Bacon and the great late Fred Ward. A movie that, by making fun of the common tropes of a giant creature movie, managed to make worms scary. So let's wrap up our chainsaws and get down to the original town where the Graboids came from. Perfection, Nevada. Tremors is the first movie of what now is one of those horror franchises that we horror fans know exist and love to pieces, but the general public may not be aware that it includes 7 movies and 1 TV series, with the latest movies being as recent as 2020, that is, 2 years ago. Not bad for a movie about giant killer worms, right? But let's talk about the first movie, a cult classic from 1990 that became a cult classic because it mixed very traditional giant monster tropes, Western movie tropes, buddy movie tropes, and comedy tropes, and did it so spectacularly that it was hard not to love the movie once you saw it. It also had an amazing cast and crew, directed by Ron Underwood, who later went on to direct a lot of episodes of many, many beloved TV series, and starring Kevin Bacon 6 years after Footloose, and right about at the beginning of him being 6 degrees away from everyone. The late great Fred Ward, as I mentioned, Finn Carter, Michael Rose, and Reba McEntire, just to start. It was written by C.C. Wilson, Brett Maddock, and Ron Underwood himself, out of a very crazy idea that Wilson and Maddock had while filming educational safety videos for none other than the U.S. Navy. As they were in a huge boulder in the desert, they wondered what would happen to them if there was something down there, like a land shark, who just wouldn't let them off the rock. Short answer, they would die, but that would have made a short and boring movie. They joined forces with Underwood, who had been working with National Geographic, directing documentaries, and had some knowledge of zoology and biology that would help make the land sharks something more realistic, for movie monster fare at least. So what is Tremors about? Handyman Valentine McKee, Bacon, and Earl Bassett, Ward, are tired of living in the middle of nowhere, the town of Perfection, Nevada. After a particularly bad day helping the inhabitants of the isolated little town, they decide to leave. However, fate seems to have other ideas. As they try to reach the next city, they notice the town drunk dead in a power line, so they have to bring him to the doctor, who tells them that the man died of thirst, having been up the power line for at least 3 days. Then they find a local herd completely massacred and their owner dead, buried in the desert. From there is a race to save the town's inhabitants, including college student Rhonda LeBeck, Carter, survivalist and gun enthusiast Burt Gummer, Gross, and wife Heather, McEntire, artist Nancy, Charlotte Stewart, and her daughter Mindy, and Ariana Richards, as well as the insufferable town prankster Melvin Plug, Bobby Jacoby, from the menace of 3 giant underground mutant worms that the town nicknames Grabbers, knowing that the worms are bigger, stronger, and far smarter than what one might think at first. Giant monster movies are pretty much as old as cinema. According to IMDb, the oldest movie in the genre is The Lost World from 1925. After that, we got the other example, the most known ape in the world, King Kong from 1933. And after a couple of sequels and a not Kong movie with a giant ape, the original Mighty Joe Young from 1949, Japan brought us the most famous giant lizard of all time, Godzilla, in 1954. And from then and until 1978, There was no single year that didn't have at least one giant creature feature in cinemas. And of course, this meant that pretty much any animal that you could possibly have in miniature was given the giant treatment because, come on, how easy it is to make the effect if all you need is to film your kid's pet tarantula walking over a well-made miniature to make it look as if a giant spider is eating New York. To be honest, I am pretty surprised that we do not have yet giant cats eat New York because, come on, if a director has a cat, that cat is going to be walking all over the miniature. With such an old tradition, there were certain rules and tropes that were already well known by the time Bal and Earl had to butt heads with the giant worms that we know as the grabbers. Tremors writers knew this well, and they took those tropes and started trying to turn them on their heads by first and foremost making sure we would care about the people in perfection before we ever saw the first grabber try and eat our main characters. It would have been very easy to make them all obviously nameless worm food, or annoying enough that one would cheer once they are in grabbing distance, if you excuse the expression. Instead, they gave them all personalities, life, and thus, even when the greedy store owner, Walter Change, seems to be ready to cheat Bal and Earl out of a great business by buying the graboid tongue for $15, then charging $5 for pictures with it, he also gives out free supplies to them when they are about to ride out of town to get help. So we feel bad when, right after coining the term graboid, we see him getting eaten alive by one of them. Ironically, the one character that in a movie today would have died pretty much immediately, Melvin, the town's annoying prankster teenager, survives not only the first movie but becomes a franchise character by appearing in the third and the TV series. And I mean it. In the first movie alone, he has 3 different close calls. One with Burt's gun due to a prank, the other 2 with an actual graboid after joking about them. And yet he survives! Seriously, even child immunity in horror movies wouldn't have protected him with a different script writer. He's that annoying. And that can also be said about the one character that pretty much everyone loves in the whole franchise. The character who pretty much holds the franchise on his shoulder because, well, he's just that amazing, and that is Burt Wommer, survivalist extraordinaire. See, Burt is the kind of character that, in a monster movie, would have been the one to die right at the end of the second act to prove that the monsters are a serious threat. He and his wife live in a bunker, preparing for World War III, with, and I quote, food for 5 years, water filtration, fallout shelter, Geiger counter, in Burt's words, and as we saw in the movie previous to that scene, enough firepower to hold a siege against a small army for those 5 years. So of course, when one graboid managed to enter the Gomer's recreation room, we, and the people in perfection who are listening through a radio, are sure that the Gomers are done for. Not so much. Because while it takes a lot of ammunition, and I mean a lot of ammunition, the graboid does find out that he broke in the wrong rec room after Burt brings out the elephant hunting gun. Yes, our gun survivalist has an elephant hunting gun. And we cheer, because hey, there's now a hope spot that doesn't end in a horrible massacre, and the Gomers are the only ones away from perfection that survived the worm's first attack. All of the other people who lived away from what can be called the town got eaten, some of them even with their cars. Another very important thing about the Gomers is that while yes, they are what we call gun nuts, and they do love their Second Amendment rights, they are also the only example I can think of a gun nut in a movie who obeys every single rule of gun safety that exists and probably invented a couple of extras. Michael Gross, who was coming out of a long stint acting as Michael J. Fox's hippie and, of course, anti-gun dad in Family Ties, has said that in interviews that he's very happy to say that in the whole franchise, Bart never once pointed his gun at a human or used it against anything that was not a worm threat. In fact, during the first movie, when Melvin tries to pretend that he was grabbed by the graboid thong, Burt chastises him because he was very close to getting shot. Because yes, Burt was ready to defend Melvin from the threat, But unlike other gun nuts in horror movies, he waited long enough to make sure that there was a threat. No wonder he was the breakout character that people loved so much that he just had to be in every single movie after the first one, right? And I mean it. He always keeps his hand away from the trigger whenever there is not an actual threat. He never points his gun at anything that is not a graboid or a threat. He's always careful not to have the gun loaded. In fact, whenever someone hands him a gun, the first thing he does is check if it is loaded, and at what point, when he gives a teenager a gun, yes, Melvin, the gun is empty. He was not going to give a kid who does not know how to use a gun a loaded gun. And even then, when he gets it back, he checks the chambers. Even a gun that he absolutely knew for a fact didn't have ammo gets checked. That's how responsible Burt Montgomery is, and that's the kind of gun owner you want. Someone who understands that guns are weapons. And sorry, I went a little bit ahead of myself with that. Of course, just having great human characters isn't enough to make a monster movie a classic. You need to have great monsters, right? And while at first the graboids in paper might not seem that memorable, because they are, at the end of the day, giant worms, they are some of the most creative monsters that have come from modern horror in a while, from their first appearance to their last, which includes some very interesting and deadly evolutions. Now, if you Google, what was the first giant worm horror movie? Chances are you will get Tremors as a result. But there had been worms in horror before 1990. The first worm horror movie I can find is Squirm, from 1976, where a colony of carnivore worms becomes incredibly aggressive when shocked with 300,000 volts of electricity. To be fair, I'd need a lot less electricity to become aggressive. The movie, while somewhat forgotten by the mainstream public now, is a bit of a cult classic due to the gruesome use of great special effects mixed with, well, live worms. There was a giant leech movie in 1959 called, of course, Attack of the Giant Leeches, but leeches, while worm-like, are not worms, so it doesn't count. Of course, the codifier for giant worms would be Dune, 1984, where the sandworms sometimes stole the frankly bizarre show directed by David Lynch. Well, the sandworms had been already known in fiction since 1965, the year when Frank Herbert published Dune, but we hadn't seen them in film until Lynch, of all people, brought them to our big screen. In 1988, Beetlejuice, a horror comedy, gave us the sandworm with two mouths, which is also a classic creature that has become one of Tim Burton's most signature creatures, despite its age. But right after Tremors, the graboids became the giant worms of horror and have remained the undisputed champions. Through the whole franchise, the graboids' life cycle was established as such. First, eggs are laid by the ass blasters. That's the name of the creature. They hatch into dirt dragons, which looks like very small graboids and can jump out of the ground in order to catch prey. Then they grow into the graboids that we all know, love, and fear. Long underground blind worms with 3 tongues that also end in individual mouths and can follow their prey through the vibration in the ground. After they have eaten a lot of food, their bodies die, but each tongue then develops into a shrieker. Finally, those shriekers also eat a ton of food in order to grow wings and develop the ability to shoot flames from its rear, getting the name Ass Blasters. Once the Ass Blaster is ready to die, it once again eats everything inside and lays 1 egg, so the cycle can begin again. The most terrifying part of the graboids, however, is their amazing ability to learn. It's really hard to kill 2 graboids the same way. When the survivors group manages to trick one into eating a homemade bomb, the second one learns to spit the same thing fast, and it also learns that sometimes the humans may make noise away from their hiding spot to lure them away, so it doesn't fall for the trick. They may be animals, but they are seriously not dumb, and that is what makes them dangerous and very, very memorable. Despite its age and the varying quality of the sequels and TV series, The original Tremors is a cult classic for very good reasons, and if you haven't seen it, you owe it to yourself to visit the not so interesting town of Perfection, Nevada, to meet their very interesting townspeople and intriguing local fauna, especially now that we lost their great actor Fred Ward, aka Earl Burt in this movie, and the first sequel, who is an incredible character, and he was an incredible character author, because this is a good reminder of who we lost and what great talent he had. And of course, I would love to know your thoughts and impression of the greatest giant war movie of all time. I want to thank my patrons Mitch Hyman, Elaine Ho, Jasik, and Ellie Riley, as well as my first supporter Tanya Pineda and the most amazing Amy Song, without whom none of my videos would be possible. I also want to remind you that if you want to support this and my other projects and get your name mentioned here, you can do so at patreon.com/Adalisa, with a link on the description, as I know my name can be hard to spell, and with just $1 a month you will always be thanked in my videos, as well as get access to a ton of art before anyone else, and get the chance to suggest future subjects for videos too. If you can't support me this way, I also accept likes, subscriptions to the channel, comments so that the algorithm catches engagement, and of course, you sharing the links. I'll also welcome all your questions, feedbacks, and suggestions in the comments below. This was Adalisa Zarate, and remember, there is not a problem in the horror genre that can be solved with more chainsaws.